in this music, we really are coming to the very limits of what we can express. And, when you compare something like that to a Marty Haugen song, strumming on the guitar, singing about how we're all gathering ourselves in and we're the body of Christ, and whatever these silly songs talk about, right? It just shatters the spirit of prayer, the spirit of adoration. It shatters that, and it distracts us and it focuses us on ourselves. It deviates and distorts, and that's very dangerous.
Hey, I'm Jim Havens. Good to meet you. I host a radio show called The Simple Truth, where we pursue the good, true, and beautiful and proclaim the life-giving reality of Jesus and his Catholic Church. Stick around. If you like it, give it a thumbs up and let us know what you think in the comments below.
Well, we are changing up our normal format today. We're going to bring in a special guest, as we mentioned, Dr. Peter Kwasniewski. He has directed choirs from 1994 to the present. And since 2018, he's been a prolific writer, speaker, editor, publisher, and composer with the intention of dedicating his life to the articulation and defense of Catholic tradition in all its dimensions. His newest release from Tan Books, Good Music, Sacred Music, and Silence, 3 Gifts of God for Liturgy and Life. Tell us a little bit about your life leading up to this book that can help us to understand something of the formation of your heart and mind that culminates in these pages.
Yes, thank you for that question. I really believe, looking back over my life, and this is true in a lot of different respects, not just in terms of music, but that's what we're focusing on today. I see the hand of the Lord guiding me, in every phase, even when I made mistakes or even when I was confused. He was very gently and patiently leading me. So, for example, I grew up in a very liberal, typical northern New Jersey, rah-rah, spirit of the council kind of parish. Covered with carpets and Eucharistic ministers with guitars and synthesizers in the music program. And I mean, that's what I grew up with. I didn't know any better. That was just my experience of Catholicism. But I always wanted to participate. And so maybe that makes me the ideal Vatican II Catholic. I don't know. But I always wanted to participate. So I sang in the choirs, children's choir, adults choir, contemporary youth choir. Then I went into the charismatic movement in high school, which again was providential, because although I recognized certain limitations with that movement in retrospect, at the same time it enkindled and activated my faith at a time in my life when I was very vulnerable to the world and to secular ways of thinking. And the people in this group were very solidly conservative Catholics, very pro-life, very pro-family, as charismatic Catholics often are. And so I think that rescued me, frankly. Then I went off to college. I went to Georgetown University for a year, and I decided after a year I'd had enough. That was absolutely not for me. I wanted to go to Thomas Aquinas College. I had found out about this amazing place, and I really wanted to embrace that great book's curriculum. But, even when I was at Georgetown, I came into contact with Opus Dei. And Opus Dei was also a lifesaver for me at that time. I had great spiritual direction there, wonderful meditations in front of the Blessed Sacrament. I think it was the beginnings of an introduction of a more traditional form of Catholicism, I would say. And then I went off to Thomas Aquinas College, and wow, when I got there, what did I see? Novus Ordo in Latin, with only men serving at the altar, with Gregorian chant, with Renaissance polyphony. I mean, I thought I'd died and gone to heaven. Like, I'd never seen anything like this before. This was an amazing experience of the liturgy. And from a musical point of view, that was true. It was impeccable, right? But then I also discovered something else in my later years at TAC, and that was the traditional Latin Mass, which came in somewhat secretly. This was the indult period, and Cardinal Mahoney was very unfriendly to the Latin Mass in the Archdiocese of Los Angeles. However, we still had it sometimes, and it also happened clandestinely as well. It was kind of, the Lord was preparing me for the Traditionis Custodes period, I suppose, having a taste of what it's like to sneak around. And so when I discovered the traditional Latin Mass and also the sung form of that, the Missa Cantata, then I realized this is the context for which this great sacred music was written. And this is where it makes the most sense. So there was a final, I would say, a clicking together of pieces that I had been picking up all along the way. And finally, it seems like everything came home. After that point, I continued to be a choir director. I continued to sing and to write music for the Novus Ordo as well as for the traditional Latin Mass. I was going to both of them for a long period of time. That was because it was part of my job to be a choir director. I had to do these things. But I would say that over the years, it really became apparent to me more and more that the liturgical difficulties that the Western Church is struggling with at this time, grievously struggling with, those problems come from certain choices that were made in the liturgical reform. And the only way to get around those problems definitively is to return to tradition. So that kind of brings me full circle, because that's what I'm doing today. Today I'm an advocate and an apologist for tradition. So maybe we'll just leave it at that.
Doctor, you do a terrific job of helping us to discover the deeper, greater, fuller beauty of music in a way that most of us have probably never known. What can you share with our listeners right now to point to that greater beauty that is there to be found in music? What can you share with us right now on that?
So everything I write about here is the fruit of my own experience. You know, I grew up as a typical modern American. I was listening to pop music, to the rock music, the bands that my older siblings listened to. I had a pretty eclectic listening habit, I could say. I was listening not just to what was on the radio, but also some of the more experimental so-called progressive rock bands from Great Britain. You know, this is just because the family I grew up in was actually very musical, but in a very modern way, if I could put it that way. I listened to jazz, Broadway musicals. It was an eclectic diet, but what was missing from it was what we call classical music, or I sometimes prefer to call it art music or fine art music, or whatever you want to call it. It's the whole realm of music that Western composers have produced since the Middle Ages, all the way through the Renaissance, the Baroque, the classical period, the Romantic period, and even into the modern period. That is music that is written with the highest artistic standards and with the most profound expression of the human soul and the whole variety and range of the emotions, right? This is great artistic music. And unfortunately, most modern Western people are exposed to none of it. They don't even know that it exists. Maybe they hear a jingle now and then, a piece of Mozart on a commercial or something like that, but they don't really know that this whole realm of music exists. And then they might think, oh, that's boring, that's for fuddy-duddies. But what they're not seeing is that their experience of music is like being in an office cubicle in the middle of a modern skyscraper with no windows, okay? And the world outside, the world of nature, like the mountains, the Rocky Mountains, or the Pacific Ocean or whatever, that's the equivalent of the world of music that exists outside of modern pop music, the stuff that's on the radio stations, okay? And so what I try to help the reader to do is to dive into that ocean, to climb that mountain of great music, right? And I mean Palestrina and William Byrd and Thomas Victoria. I mean Mozart, Beethoven, Schubert. I mean Bach, Handel, Vivaldi. I mean Ralph Vaughan Williams, Maurice Duruflé, and even some of Igor Stravinsky. Or Prokofiev. There's so much great music from all these centuries. And so I try to be very concrete with my reader. I say, look, this is an unknown world. You might as well be going on a safari into the African jungle. You have no idea what you're looking for. So here's a list. I'm going to give you lists of music. Here are pieces that almost everybody enjoys when they listen to them, right? And so I give playlists. I give advice for how to get into these more artistic forms of music. And then I make arguments as to why it's important. Why is it important for our moral and intellectual life? And to put it very simply, a lot of modern popular music is premised on aggressively stirring up the emotions, the lower emotions, the most animalistic emotions of human beings. Namely, I would say lust and anger, ultimately, is what a lot of popular music is about. Heavy metal music, for instance, is full of anger, and a lot of pop music is full of lust. The goal of not just the words or the way the words are sung, but also the style of the music, it's meant to enkindle these lower passions in us and really to make us dominated by them. right? That's an unhealthy way for human beings to live. It's not a virtuous way to live. It's definitely not a Christian way to live. Whereas when you listen to greater forms of music, higher forms of music, they have a way of elevating our minds. They have a way of ennobling our hearts. They give us something really beautiful to sink our spiritual teeth into. Over time, I think they actually make it easier to lead a virtuous life.
As I read the book, I had a range of emotions from anger to excitement. Somewhat angry because it's been a deliberate effort by the very people who should be providing this, namely the hierarchy. But excited because as someone with no musical background, one who never even learned how to read music, what's in store for me? You know, there's so much that we haven't been able to internalize with this music. And you say in so many places in the book what that sacred music in particular, what's appropriate for the Mass, does for us when we do internalize it. And that's where our relationship with Christ starts. So that's one of the many quotes or parts of the book that struck me was, you know, we have to be willing to embrace what's always been there for us, but has been suppressed for whatever reasons. Maybe we can get into those later in the show too, but this internalization of the music, beauty of the silence of prayer, I think all ties into what you alluded to in your last comment, Doctor. So I appreciate that.
Yes, I think that there's been tremendous amnesia is one of the ways I like to describe it. A true forgetfulness on the part of not just the church towards her own heritage, but also of Western people in general towards their cultural inheritance. Modern people tend to be very trapped in the particular confines of their own place and time. We don't think in large and exalted terms about the whole tradition that we belong to. You talked about sacred music specifically. I was just making the point more broadly about music in general, that these two things go hand in hand. When people have a better sense of the beauty of music as an art form, and not just listening to good music, but also learning how to sing and learning how to make music, which is difficult to do for some people if they've never tried, but everybody can do it and everybody should try to do it. If they can get a better sense of the art of music, then they'll become more sensitive to how that art is supposed to be utilized for the liturgy. What does it mean to have truly appropriate sacred music? What are the qualities of that? What effect is it supposed to have on us, right? If people don't know the right questions to ask about music, or they don't have the right instincts about music in general, they're also going to have poor instincts about liturgical music as well. So I see these things as very much interconnected. And I will say that very few people I've read in the Catholic world talk about these things together. They mostly just zero in on liturgical music, and they talk about the rules. You know, what are the rules for that? Well, these rules don't really make sense unless you put them in a larger context, I would say.
Talking about the fine arts, and in this case, the fine arts being music, this really is for everybody to receive. It's not for just special high class people to receive this. And there's something about a unity of life in all of this that complements the faith, and it needs to be received and handed on through the generations. Anything you'd like to share on it?
Gosh, there's so much to say about this question. I mean, it's incredible when you look into the history of what we call pop music. I'm just going to use that expression to cover a bunch of different types of music that people listen to on the radio. You know, when you look into the history of that, this is music that's very recent in vintage. Nothing like it ever existed before, and it's heavily produced and pushed by a capitalist corporate mechanism, right? Which the internet and the various forms of mass-produced music delivery, I mean, already going back to LPs, then cassettes, then CDs, then finally the internet, which is sort of the final frontier as far as making things instantly and universally available. There's a captive audience, and this product is pumped to them constantly. It has almost the effect of a drug because it appeals to our lower passions. And you find Aristotle, St. Thomas, St. Augustine, they all talk about this phenomenon. If you feed the lower passions continually with stimulation, with a diet of music that stimulates them, that becomes addictive. Okay, that's as addictive as a drug. And even Joseph Ratzinger talks about this. So this is not me saying crazy things. I mean, I quote a lot of people who who recognize this psychological fact. And that's why it's difficult to break out of it. It's difficult to break out of it. What I want to emphasize is this. The reason we should listen to great music is not to be elitist, not to say, oh, I've got better taste than you. No, it's to open up the horizons of our human life. It's to have vast horizons about reality. It's to see the full depth and breadth of the cosmos that God has created. When you look at the work of not just great composers, mind you, but also folk music, authentic, human, healthy, oral tradition folk music from all cultures, it deals with beautiful human themes. It deals with innocent love, with marriage, with children. It deals with loyalty, with friendship, patriotism. It deals with wonder and amazement at the stars and the planets and the mountains and the rivers. The horizons of music are vast. And if you look at modern pop music, it's all very monotonous. It's very vulgar, typically. And it's giving you like a slit through which to look at reality. And you're seeing only this slit of reality, if I could put it that way. So let me just share with you this thought. I talk about this in the book on pages 50 and 51. I say, it seems to me that we could relate styles of music to 4 types of food. Genuine sacred music is like heavenly food, such as the angels feast upon, right? Gregorian chant, Palestrina. Beautiful secular music is like royal food, fit for a king's high table. Good folk music is like whole food, suitable for healthy consumption. You know, that's like the crunchy grain-based diet, right? With organic and no additives. And modern popular music is like fast food or junk food, suitable for no one. We have this sort of array of musical diets, just to use that analogy. And the question is, are we going to consume junk food? Or are we going to consume gourmet food or even celestial food? What are we eating? When we take music into our souls, it's like consuming some version of the truth or some presentation of reality. That's what it's like to take music into our souls. And people don't think about it this way, but it's actually really clear when you stop and think about it.
I guess about just understanding that sense of we want to go to the highest. We want those vistas to be broken open. If we want to do that with good music in our leisure time, certainly we want to do that with the best music in our time of worship in the liturgy. Anything you want to say about what really that high point, the ideal liturgy, that ideal music ought to truly look like?
Yeah, I mean, it seems to follow from everything that we've been talking about that when you are coming before Almighty God, I mean, we're always in God's presence, right? And we're supposed to cultivate the presence of God wherever we are. But when we enter into a consecrated church and we come before the tabernacle, the Blessed Sacrament, and we come before the altar, which is a symbol of Christ himself, and we're going to enter into the supreme mystery of his self-offering on the cross, right? This is a transcendent moment. This is a moment for fear and awe and humility and immense devotion and piety, right? We need the help at such a moment of all of the fine arts. We need their help because a beautiful church, like a Gothic church, it instantly lifts our minds and hearts to God. It just has that effect. It was designed to do that. When we look at a beautiful high altar where everything is focused towards the crucifix and the tabernacle and the altar, it draws us, it centers us, it anchors us, right, to Christ. It's all of these things are symbols of Christ. Because God is infinite and eternal and inaccessible, you know, to our senses, that is directly, the fine arts become like mediators for us. They hold our hand and they guide us into the mysteries of our faith. And so music is exactly the same way. When we hear this otherworldly, this sort of wonderfully strange sound of Gregorian chant beginning in the liturgy, we know instantly that we are in a different place and we're doing something different and something special and something that goes beyond this world. It doesn't leave this world behind, but it also goes beyond it, right? And when we hear the strains of Renaissance polyphony, we hear a motet or a mass, you know, by Thomas Tallis or any of these great Renaissance composers, it has this effect on us of like, we just suddenly feel this serenity. We have a sense of now this music is this offering, this worthy offering to God that takes us with it and offers us to God as well. So it's not just that we need the benefit of the arts, it's also that we need and we ought to give God the best that we can, the finest works of our hands. That's what we should give him. And anybody who knows anything about music will be able to see that what the great composers have given us is at the very limit of the genius of the human mind that God created, right? In this music, we really are coming to the very limits of what we can express and what we can depict and what we can suggest, right? And, when you compare something like that to a Marty Haugen song, strumming on the guitar, singing about how, we're all gathering ourselves in and we're the body of Christ and, and we care for Mother Nature and whatever these silly songs talk about, right? It just shatters the spirit of prayer, the spirit of adoration, the spirit of, I would call it self-abnegation, right? Of falling before the throne of God to ask for his mercy and love. It shatters that, and it distracts us and it focuses us on ourselves. It's completely the opposite movement. It's what Ratzinger called horizontal rather than vertical, right? It's circular. It's like the enclosed circle versus, the aspiration to heaven. And so really, it's not just that modern church music is poorly written, though it is typically that, but it's that it's contrary to the very nature of the sacred liturgy. It acts against what the liturgy is supposed to do. And this is why I say very strong words in my book about what's wrong with this music. It's not just that it's inferior, it's that it deviates and distorts. And that's very dangerous.
How did Bonini get away with this revolutionary action against the liturgy that has been so disastrous down into our time? What happened, and why? I guess weren't there more voices speaking up, stopping it? Or what can you say to it?
Especially, so you're asking, why did John Paul II, why did Benedict XVI not do more to clean up the mess in the church? And I think there are multiple levels to that. First of all, and this is easy to prove, they did not know everything that was going wrong. I mean, John Paul II, he had many good qualities, but he was also quite naive. And we know that, for example, with the clerical abuse crisis, he didn't believe what people were telling him. He couldn't believe that McCarrick, for example, was as guilty as he was. He thought people were slandering him. And this was a pattern. John Paul II grew up in a devout Polish culture where it was unimaginable that there would be clergy who would be so corrupt, right? I'm not saying that, there have always been corrupt clergy, but on the level, the magnitude that we've seen in the past decades is something that's, you could understand a person being skeptical about that, right? Unfortunately, sadly, tragically, we know that it's true, that this corruption really exists. But then there's also a deeper level, which is that Karol Wojtyła and Joseph Ratzinger, to use their baptismal names, they were steeped in modern thought, just as Giovanni Battista Montini was. They all studied modern philosophy and theology. They were pickled to the gills in modern thought. And yet they also grew up in Catholic cultures, and they were people of wide reading habits, and they were very thoughtful and prayerful people. So I see them as being kind of like hippogriffs, like mixtures of traditional and modern sentiments and ideas, right? That's the only way to make sense of the contradictory and paradoxical aspects of their papacies. They're not dyed-in-the-wool modernists. I'm sorry, but I can't accept that view. It doesn't square with the facts. But neither are they fully consistent with Catholic tradition either. They have too much of modernity mingled in with their thinking. They're not sufficiently critical of those aspects of modernity. And so I think what you see in somebody like Ratzinger is a basic confidence in the rightness of Vatican II and in the rightness of a rapprochement between the modern world and the Catholic Church, but mingled with a lot of traditional piety and a lot of traditional sentiments and just certain good Catholic instincts, right? And so those instincts and those intuitions, they came out in his liturgical views. They came out in his favoring freedom for the traditional Roman rite. They came out in his love for the great music of the West and for sacred music, right? When it comes to why didn't he do something to clean up the mess, I think both, I agree with Windswept House of Malachi Martin to the extent that that's true, and also of things that Peter Zewald has said about Benedict XVI, that these popes felt that they had a limited amount of effective authority over what was happening. That's not to say they didn't make mistakes. They shouldn't have made certain people bishops and cardinals, for sure. There's a famous statement where apparently Benedict XVI said to somebody, "My authority stops at that door," meaning, the door of his office. He was so well aware of how much people hated him and how weak the word of the Pope actually was. If he said everybody has to start celebrating the traditional Mass, people wouldn't have done that. I mean, some people would have done it, but most people would have just ignored it, the way that they had ignored Humanae Vitae of Paul VI. So we have to understand we're living in a revolutionary era, and that means people are anti-authoritarian. So the idea that a pope could just flex his papal muscles and suddenly everybody's going to obey him, that's impossible. That's not happening. And it's not even happening under Pope Francis. I mean, even though there are, plenty of circumcellions, these Donatist thugs going around on behalf of Pope Francis and trying to shame people and threaten people and say you have to agree with Pope Francis that you're a bad Catholic or you're schismatic, right? There are plenty of people doing that, but sorry, it isn't working. I mean, I know bishops, they might be quiet, they might be keeping their heads down, but I know bishops who can't stand Pope Francis and don't agree with anything that he's saying or doing, right? And that's even more true when you get to the lower clergy, and it's even more true when you get to the laity. The Francis Revolution is going to die with Francis. I mean, I'm pretty convinced of that fact. Those are just some thoughts, granted not a complete account, but.
Okay, I just want to follow up with the chapter, a blueprint for parish musical restoration, wherein you find this, you have a model pastoral letter on sacred music that any bishop could take up and do something similar. Have you heard from any bishops? Have they read the book at all? Have you heard of anything in that regard?
Yeah, so I can tell you this much. Archbishop Salvatore Cordileone of San Francisco, he did read this book. And in fact, he gave me a very gracious endorsement of it, which you can read on the back cover. He and I see eye to eye when it comes to the question of sacred music. And he, among all of the bishops of the United States, has done the most to promote fine art. I'm sure you know about his Benedict XVI Institute. That institute has commissioned beautiful masses. They've commissioned painting and sculpture. They've renovated churches. I mean, they've done so many wonderful things to beautify and to elevate the liturgy. I do know that there are a number of bishops who agree with me on these points. But as far as pastoral letters are concerned, no, I'm afraid not. I think that Archbishop Sample, well, he wasn't Archbishop when he wrote the letter, but now Archbishop Sample is the only one I'm aware of who had the courage and the clarity and the learning required to articulate a vision for sacred music and then to say to his diocese, this was Marquette, everybody has to follow these diocesan policies. And amazingly, as I point out, his successor did not, pitch the document into the bin, but actually confirmed it and said, yes, we're going to keep doing this. I think that's amazing, and you're right. If you can think of any bishop to give this book to and send him to the chapter about the blueprint, please go ahead and do that.
Was that a helpful video for you? I sure hope so. That's why we do this show, to help real people get real results, advancing in the way, the truth, and the life that we're made for. It's called The Simple Truth. It's a radio program Monday through Friday, and we live stream it right here on this channel. Make sure to subscribe, like, and share if you would be so kind. And if you like that last video, here's another one I think you might get a lot out of.